The Legends of King Arthur. No Ordinary Boy. Retold by Tracy Mayhew, illustrated by Mike Phillips. Chapter 1. Merlin was no ordinary 8-year-old boy. Like a few other children in his village, he had grown up without parents. Unlike the others, his father had been a demon, and his human mother had abandoned him soon after his birth. Being the son of a demon had given Merlin very special powers. He could not only see into the future, but he could also make powerful potions that healed the sick, or even turned people into animals. This meant that although people needed him, they also feared him. They needed him to make their sick and wounded well again, but Merlin's power frightened them. It was the fear in the villagers' eyes that always reminded Merlin of what he was, and of who his father had been. Today had started like any other. Merlin walked through the small village where he lived, and where nothing ever seemed to happen. People followed him, as they did every day, asking for potions or seeking answers to their troubles. But can you make the nightmares go away? An old woman asked. She panted hard as she scurried alongside him, trying to keep up. Looking at her, Merlin slowed his pace. Yes. Visit me tomorrow, he said. T'll have a potion ready? The woman nodded and began to back away, when suddenly the air was filled with the sound of thunder. Merlin frowned. No, not thunder. Everyone's attention was drawn to the south, curious to see the source of the noise. A few older boys shoved their way past Merlin, almost knocking him over in their haste. Beside him, the old woman's face twisted in fear. What's that? She asked. Horses, someone shouted excitedly. Quickly moving through the crowd, Merlin reached the front. His attention was fixed on the near horizon. He stared in wonder as horses and their riders surged over the hilltop, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. Never had he seen this many horsemen. And they weren't just horsemen, these were knights. Their tunics bore the king's coat of arms, a red dragon on a golden background. The king's men reined their horses to a stop, leaving several villagers coughing dust. The leader pulled off his helmet and stood up in his stirrups, his gaze searching the crowd before him. In the name of King Vortigern, we seek a boy who has no mortal father, he called out. A boy with great power. Merlin's heart quickened, but he didn't dare move. One by one, the villagers began to whisper and look his way. Some even pointed in his direction. Finally, a rough hand pushed him forwards, causing him to stumble from the crowd. The leader looked down at him as the other knights removed their helmets to do the same. I have no mortal father, Merlin declared, lifting his chin to look directly at the knight. He didn't want to appear scared in front of everyone. The knight dismounted, his eyes never leaving Merlin's face as he walked over to him. And you have powers? He asked. Merlin held his gaze and nodded, determined to be brave despite the knight towering over him. The knight studied Merlin for a moment, before grabbing his shirt and dragging him over to a hooded man. Is this him? He demanded. Is this the boy you want? The man said nothing as Merlin looked up at him. He strained to see a face within the vastness of the hood. Well, the knight demanded, shaking Merlin impatiently. Slowly the hooded man nodded, making no sound. Even his horse stood silent and still, unlike the animals around him who seemed impatient to be off again and pawed at the ground restlessly. The knight thrust Merlin towards another man, who quickly tied his wrists together, not caring that the rope cut deeply into his skin. What do you want with me? Merlin demanded, his fear finally getting the better of him. It was the hooded man who answered. He will ride with me, he announced, in voice that spoke of deep woods and dark caverns. Merlin quaked, terrified at the very idea. Even from this distance, he could feel the man's power, strong and dangerous. It called to Merlin, pulling him forwards even as he struggled against the iron grip on his shoulder. Jerking him back, the second knight murmured into his ear, "It will be much easier for you if you don't try to fight us, boy." But Merlin continued to struggle. "Where are you taking me?" The hooded man chuckled. "You will know soon enough, Merlin." Hearing his name, Merlin stilled. What was going on? How did this man know who he was? Questions ran through his mind. Before he could ask any more of them, the hooded man muttered in a strange language, and Merlin's world went black. Chapter 2. Merlin awoke to a pounding in his head and a sick feeling in his stomach. The world around him was dark and cold, and as he blinked his eyes open, he was aware of goosebumps covering his arms and legs. He tried to sit up, but his wrists were still tied together, leaving him to fall back to the ground with a cry of frustration. Slowly moving his head, he began to take in his surroundings. A campfire had been lit in the center of a small clearing. Although the fire was dying out now, there was enough light to see the knights sleeping under their blankets. Squinting into the distance, he could just about see their horses, tethered beneath some trees. "You're awake," then, a gruff voice murmured. Merlin jumped. Craning his neck, he saw a knight sitting against a tree, watching him. Shifting around to see him better, Merlin managed to struggle into a sitting position. "Aren't you going to help me?" he asked, holding up his wrists. The knight smiled. "Why? You seem to be doing quite well by yourself." Merlin glared but said nothing. He drew his knees up to his chest as his stomach began to growl. "Hungry?" the knight asked. Merlin watched as the man reached into his saddlebag, pulled out some dried meat and tossed it to him. "Eat," he instructed. "You have to keep your strength up for what's ahead." "What do you mean? What's going to happen to me?" The knight shrugged. "You think I know?" He laughed and scratched his beard. "No one tells me anything, boy." Merlin bit hard into the meat, still watching the knight carefully as he chewed. "You're the one who tied me up. You remember that, then?" The knight's eyes flicked briefly across the camp. Following them, Merlin found himself looking at the hooded man sitting on a rock beyond the campfire. He was focused on the runes he had just cast, studying their symbols as they lay scattered across the ground. Merlin swallowed hard. Who is he? What did he do to me? The knight was silent for so long that Merlin began to wonder if he would answer him at all. Eventually he said, "He is King Vortigern's advisor. He knew my name. He knows many things." "Like what?" "That's not for me to know." The knight was studying Merlin as curiously as Merlin was studying the hooded man. "But why does he want you?" Merlin shook his head. "I don't know." "I don't think that's true." The knight nodded towards the hooded man. "He seemed to think you knew exactly why he was looking for you." "What makes you so special, boy?" Merlin's fear returned. A strange yet familiar feeling was creeping up on him, a sure sign he was about to have a vision. Ignoring it, he focused on the knight and said simply, "I'm different from other boys." "Different?" the knight asked. Merlin nodded. "Different how?" "I can see things sometimes, things that will happen. And I can make potions that heal the sick." The knight raised his eyebrows. "Well then, I understand why King